Hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture on Chapter 4. So in Chapter 4, we begin Unit 2, which means we're done with Unit 1, and now we're going to kind of move into a lot of that content that we talked about in Unit 1 in greater depth. So Unit 2 is all about the macronutrients and metabolism. So we're going to have a chapter apiece for carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, are three macronutrients. So that's chapters 4, 5, and 6, and then chapter 7 is about metabolism, which we will focus largely on how our bodies harness the calories that are in carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And then we'll also talk about some of those other functions, particularly of lipids and proteins, right? Because I said that proteins, we really don't derive a ton of our calories from proteins, although they do contain calories. But by and large, proteins have really important structural and functional roles for our bodies. And lipids, they kind of cut the difference. They do provide a lot of our calories, but they also have really important structural functional roles, particularly the phospholipids and the sterols. So today, in Chapter 4, we're going to be talking about carbohydrates. So the way this chapter is broken out, or the way this lecture is broken out, which does follow your textbook pretty closely, we're going to introduce carbohydrates, the different types of carbohydrates that we can identify from kind of the simplest form to the largest, most complex form. We're going to talk about how our bodies regulate the amount of glucose that's in our bloodstream, which is kind of a critical life function. And then we will review a little bit the digestion, absorption, and transportation of carbohydrates. Again, kind of a review from Chapter 3. And then we'll talk about a lot of the diseases or disorders associated with carbohydrate intake, and particularly carbohydrate metabolism. So Chapter 4, since there is a lot of content, I am going to divide it up into 2 lectures. So this first lecture, we will focus more on identifying and naming what carbohydrates are, and then we will talk about that blood glucose regulation. And then the next part will focus more on the disorders associated with carbohydrate digestion and metabolism. So again, a lot of this first few slides will be a little review. So remember, we said that we have 3 macronutrients, and carbohydrates is one of them. Remember, we said that one of the primary role of carbohydrate is to provide energy or calories for all cells throughout our body. We said in particular for our nervous cells and the cells in our brains. Remember, I said that macronutrients are all composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And that's, of course, true here for carbohydrates. And we'll kind of intermittently come back to food sources of carbohydrate. But in general, it's our plant foods. We really don't get much in the way of carbohydrate from meat, fish, eggs. We can get some carbohydrate from milk. But in general, the healthiest sources of carbohydrate in our diets are unprocessed, so as kind of close to nature as possible, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. I couldn't overemphasize the importance of understanding that glucose is the basic unit of a carbohydrate. I have a few images coming up that will hopefully give you some context for this. You're all probably familiar with glucose in some capacity, or you're at least familiar with sugar. And glucose and sugar are, for all intents and purposes, synonymous with each other. And glucose, therefore sugar, is the basic unit of a carbohydrate molecule. Glucose can also exist by itself, and it does in our bodies, and it exists by itself in some of our foods. There's not a ton of it that exists by itself in our food. Usually glucose exists in our food as part of this large carbohydrate molecule. So in order for us to get glucose into the body, again, the healthiest way is by eating unprocessed whole foods that have these large carbohydrates in them. In the 21st century, of course, we can eat a lot of junk food and a lot of sweetened foods that have been sweetened with individual glucose molecules. That's really where we run into trouble with glucose digestion and metabolism. So again, glucose is absolutely critical to our life and our body's capacity to be healthy and to thrive and to function. How we get glucose from our food is probably of paramount importance. So where does glucose come from? If you're interested, glucose comes from plants. Plants have this ability to undergo a process called photosynthesis, and that usually happens in their leaves. And what happens is the plants take carbon dioxide from the air and energy from the sun, heat energy from the sun, and they're able to convert those sources, particularly the carbon dioxide, into glucose. So they're not really showing, and water too, I'm sorry. So they can take carbon dioxide and water, and again, carbon dioxide is carbon and oxygen, and water is hydrogen and oxygen, right? So from carbon dioxide and water, plants make carbohydrate, which is just a rearrangement of the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then plants store that glucose in a larger carbohydrate molecule known as starch. And then in the process of photosynthesis, plants give off oxygen. So again, this is why we get glucose from plants, is because they make the glucose. This is why we don't really get glucose from animals or eggs or fish, because animals don't make glucose. Again, mammals and the milk of mammals, including humans, does contain a small amount of carbohydrate, which we'll talk about in a moment. So in addition to glucose, we're going to learn the names of a lot of other carbohydrates. To talk about glucose merely skims the surface, although it's perhaps the most important name to recall in the context of carbohydrates. So we can further classify carbohydrates, I would say, in 3 ways. These slides are going to show us 4, but really 1 and 2 are the same things. So that could have been better organized. I'll just highlight this separately. Disaccharides. So the 3 sort of subcategories of carbohydrate that I want you to understand are monosaccharides, in other words, a simple monosaccharide, it's called that. Let me erase this actually. Okay, this will make sense in a minute. So the 3 categories of carbohydrates are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides, or complex carbohydrates. So let's go back here and talk through each of them. So monosaccharide and disaccharide are here on the same page because collectively these are simple sugars or simple carbohydrates, commonly referred to as sugar. We can still see that. So simple carbohydrate means there's 1 or 2 sugar molecules. Monosaccharide, mono, hopefully you can identify that prefix, mono meaning 1, right? And this is a term to familiarize yourself. Saccharide is the, I think, Greek word for sugar. So monosaccharide means 1 sugar. Disaccharide, similarly, di means 2. And again, saccharide means sugar. So monosaccharide has 1 sugar. Disaccharide has 2 sugars. On the earlier page, I said that glucose is synonymous with the word sugar. Oops, sorry. So too, we could say fructose is somewhat synonymous with sugar, and so is galactose. Ribose is a sugar that's critical in our bodies, but we aren't really going to focus on ribose so much because we're not typically ingesting ribose for the purpose of energy. So our class is really going to focus on glucose, fructose, and galactose. These are our 3 monosaccharides. Each one of them is an individual sugar molecule. So here's the visual representation of this. So glucose, it's a 1 unit sugar. It's just 1 sugar. Fructose is similarly just 1 molecule. So this whole structure here is what we call a molecule. And then galactose, same thing. This is just 1 molecule of glucose. Sorry, this is 1 molecule of galactose. If you do like chemistry, or if you remember from chemistry, these molecules are technically isomers with one another, which means they have the same chemical formula, which you might recall from last chapter is C6H12O6, right? So each one of these has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. They just have them in slightly different arrangements. Down below it shows you what foods we find these types of sugars in. So glucose we find in pretty much every food that we eat, plant foods in particular. Fructose we find in fruit. Fructose is pretty sweet, like it has the sweetest flavor of any of these 3 sugars. We do also find fructose in some vegetables, for example, corn. And so when we take the liquid from corn and then concentrate it, we can wind up concentrating the fructose, hence the product high fructose corn syrup. And then galactose, this is important to understand. Galactose never occurs alone in food. It only occurs bound to glucose, which makes lactose. We'll talk about that in a second. So we only find galactose in milk as part of a disaccharide with glucose. So let's go back here. So those are our monosaccharides, individual sugar molecules. Disaccharides mean we have 2 of those sugar molecules. So really straightforward, the disaccharides are just some combination of glucose, fructose, and galactose. The disaccharides all have their own names, lactose, maltose, and sucrose. What we'll see here is that disaccharides, again, are just 2 of the monosaccharides bound to each other, hence making a 2 sugar molecule. So lactose, as we just saw on the earlier slide, is galactose bound to glucose. So you have 2, 1, 2, you have 2 sugar molecules. This we only find in milk. Maltose is 2 glucose molecules bound to each other, glucose plus glucose. This is again what we find in a lot of our food. We don't again find maltose per se by itself. Usually we're going to, as we digest a more large complex carbohydrate, we're going to break down, again you'll see it in a minute, we're going to break down this long chain of glucose ultimately into little 2 sugar segments. So we're going to wind up with a lot of maltose in the digestion process. We also have maltose in the fermentation process, right, which is basically bacterial digestion. So again, maltose is common, for example, in brewing beer, right, where the larger carbohydrate molecules of, say, barley or rye or even wheat have been fermented to create alcohol and to create maltose. And then the last disaccharide for our purposes is sucrose, and sucrose is glucose bound to fructose bound to glucose. So notice really quickly, glucose is present in each of these 3 disaccharides. And that's why we said on the earlier slide, it's the one to really, if you take a single message from this first part of the chapter, understand that glucose is really the basic unit of the carbohydrate. And then depending on the food source, if it's milk, we might also see galactose. And then in fruits and some of our vegetables, we might also see the fructose. So sucrose we find in sugarcane, sugar beets, and honey. And again, a lot of our fruits. I don't know why that doesn't say that. Okay, So monosaccharide and disaccharide, collectively we can call these the simple carbohydrates or simple sugars basically. So this term is referring to molecules that have compounds that have one or two sugar molecules in them. And then complex carbohydrates. So this is really kind of the bulk of what we'll talk about when we talk about carbohydrates, especially in our food. So complex carbohydrate, we could also say there are kind of two subcategories. We could say there are oligosaccharides and polysaccharides, which is true. Oligo just means that there are, a few. Oligo means a few saccharides, so a few saccharides, a few sugars. So an oligosaccharide contains 3 to 10 monosaccharides, or 3 to 10 sugars. Polysaccharide, poly means many, saccharide means sugar, so polysaccharide, many sugars. So there are hundreds to thousands, that's very many, sugar molecules or monosaccharides that make up a polysaccharide. So hundreds to thousands of glucose molecules make up a polysaccharide. We're going to talk about three types of complex carbohydrates: starch, glycogen, and fiber. I'm just going to jump right here to this slide really quickly because I want to give you the schematic, or the visual of what I mean what we mean when we say there are hundreds to thousands of glucose molecules bound to each other. So these are kind of condensed images and obviously drawings of our three types of complex carbohydrates: starch, glycogen, and fiber. Remember that glucose, hang on, I'm going to go back here. Well, this is showing glucose, but just so you have it named, where glucose is this, it's actually a six-sided molecule, and it's a hexagon, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a hexagon. So each of these little green hexagons is representing glucose. You don't need to count these out because obviously it's not showing 100 or even 1,000 or even 100. But you get the idea. This is just like a glimpse of a piece of amylose or a piece of glycogen or a piece of fiber. And so what these molecules are, again, are these giant large chains with branches of glucose. They're kind of like, sometimes I use the analogy of a boxcar train, right? If you ever get stuck behind, waiting for a train to pass, there's like all the cars just keep coming. It's like the train is the complex carbohydrate, and each boxcar is glucose. And there could be, again, hundreds or even thousands of glucose boxcars in that complex carbohydrate train. While we're on this slide, I guess, worth noting kind of the slightly different layouts, right, or structures of these different complex carbohydrates. So amylose is really just a chain, like kind of a straight chain. Amylopectin is a little more complex, has some of this branching, right? And then some branching off the branching. Glycogen looks a lot like amylopectin, kind of a central chain, lots of branching. And then fiber looks like a brick, right? It's kind of straight lines. And if you notice kind of the binding or how these molecules of glucose are held together, they're held together side by side and top to bottom, right? So fiber, we would say then, is really tough and rigid, right? And again, you probably know that if you've ever, even a piece of corn, right? Even just that outer layer of the little corn kernel is a little tough. You have to really chew it, right? Or even the skin of most vegetables, or even some fruits that we eat, like the skin of an apple or a pear, or certainly like the skin of a carrot or a beet, a little tougher, right? Those are sort of the most obvious examples of fiber in our food, in our fruits and vegetables. Beans, again, beans or legumes like black beans, kidney beans, chickpeas, as well as lentils and whole grains like oatmeal. Like if you've ever had oatmeal, and especially if you make it fresh or you use steel cut oats, you got to do a lot of chewing. That's because there's a lot of fiber in there, and fiber is really tough. It's kind of dense. It's very complex. So those are kind of the visual representations of our complex carbohydrates. So let's talk through each one in a little more detail. So let's talk first about starch. And if you remember back to the slide, if I'll go there, not that far away. If you remember back to this slide, it said right here, plants store glucose as starch. Definitely remember that. That's really important. And don't just remember it for class, but learn it, understand it, know it for the rest of your life, because it's never going to change. And you eat plants, hopefully, every day. So the storage form of carbohydrate in plants is starch. You've probably heard the word starch before in reference to like, oh, potatoes are starchy, or beets are starchy, or fruits are starchy. Yes, they are. They contain a lot of complex carbohydrates, which are critical to human health. There are two types of starches that we're going to learn about in this class. One is called amylose. We just saw the picture, and amylopectin, right? Amylose is a little straighter, amylopectin a little more branchy. And then there's a third type of starch. Sorry, I said we learned two. There's a third type of starch, which sometimes has its own category, but it's on this page. So we'll put it here. The third type of starch is called resistant starch, which honestly acts a bit more like fiber, which is why fiber is in parentheses here. The reason resistant starches are more like fiber is because they're largely indigestible or undigestible by humans. We will talk, and we even introduced in chapter 3 that the bacteria that live in our intestines, the microbiome, can digest fiber. The symbiotic bacteria do. And that's part of the symbiotic relationship we have with these bacteria, is that humans can't digest fiber actually, but the bacteria can. And so if we have a really healthy gut microbiome, which is really only possible by eating a healthy diet and taking care of yourself otherwise, then the bacteria will digest that fiber. And in their fermentation of fiber, they give off these little fatty acid molecules that we then absorb and utilize. And again, we also said that in digesting the fibers, they release some vitamins from the food that were kind of bound up in the fiber. So resistant starch acts a bit like fiber in that it cannot be digested by humans, but can be digested by the bacteria. Again, complex carbohydrates we find in our plant foods, especially our whole, relatively unprocessed plant foods, whole grains, beans, fruits, and vegetables. Right here also is this word beta bond, right? And the reason we can't digest resistant starch or fiber is because they have beta bonds. That's how the glucose molecules bind to each other, is through a beta bond. You might get a question or two on a test about the alpha and the beta bonds. So I guess it is worth recognizing or understanding that beta bonds are the bonds that our bodies can't break apart. Remember in chapter 3, we also learned about enzymes, which are these protein molecules that speed up reactions. When we're digesting our food, right, we're starting, and most of the time we're starting with these large complex carbohydrates, starch, fiber, which we're not really digesting, and then glycogen we're going to see is actually in our own bodies, but sometimes we still break glycogen down. So when we're breaking down starch or we're breaking down glycogen, what we're doing is breaking apart the chain, or breaking apart these chains of glucose, right? So we're kind of sloughing off one glucose, cut off the next, cut off the next, cut off the next, right? We're cutting these large glucose chains into smaller and smaller pieces. So in order to cut the glucose molecules apart from one another, we have to be able to kind of dissolve the bond between the two glucose molecules, or between the glucose and the fructose. So in an alpha bond, the orientation of the bond of the two molecules bound to each other is such that we have enzymes that can work on that bond and help to break it apart. I think, interestingly, the beta bond is in such an orientation, and you can see right here, it's a little kinked, right? Where the alpha bond is like a little more neutral, the beta bond is a little kinked. Humans don't have enzymes that can actually get in there and break apart a beta bond, which is why we say that any of these carbohydrate molecules that are bound through beta bonds are indigestible by humans: resistant starch and fiber. And here on this slide, if you've noticed, a third, lactose. And where did we see lactose? Milk sugar, right? Lactose is milk sugar, right? This blue molecule here is galactose, and the green one is glucose. So yes, take a second for this to set in. If this is the first time you're understanding this or learning this, humans can't actually digest lactose as adults. As infants, yes, we do have an enzyme which is called lactase, right? Lact for lactose, ase for enzyme. Lactase is an enzyme that infant humans make that allows them to break apart a beta bond. But for most of human history, humans only drank human milk. And so once an infant was weaned from their mother's breast milk, they stopped producing lactase because they weren't ever going to drink milk again. And so still here in the 21st century, roughly 2/3 of the adult human population continues to not make lactase into adulthood. We do, thanks to European, the European history, a lot of people of European descent do drink cow's milk or goat's milk or sheep's milk. And so a small subset of the population, roughly a third, has maintained an ability to produce lactase into adulthood. But 2/3 of the human population worldwide does not produce lactase into adulthood, which is part of where a lot of people have issues digesting milk or cheese or yogurt, is because they can't actually digest the sugar in it. And that's where they get sometimes GERD or other gastrointestinal distress, inflammation, bloating, and otherwise general discomfort from eating cow's milk, goat's milk, or sheep's milk products. So the beta bond is the orientation of the bond between monosaccharides that humans cannot digest. We find beta bonds in 3 places. This is usually a test question. Beta bonds exist in lactose, resistant starches, and fiber. Okay, so glycogen, the second of our 3 complex carbohydrates. So glycogen, similar to starch in that it's a storage form of glucose, but glycogen is how animals, including humans, store glucose. Plants store glucose as starch. Humans and other animals store glucose as glycogen. We don't store a whole lot of glycogen. In fact, we store relatively small amounts of glycogen, like enough to get us through most of a day, but that's about the maximum glycogen we can store. We store our glycogen primarily in our liver and our muscles. And if you've noticed, right, your liver, or here on the right side, your liver, for the most part, isn't just sort of like continually growing and growing and growing, and your muscles similarly aren't just like growing and growing and growing. So just keep that in mind. There's a reason why we can't store so much, or why we don't store so much glycogen, right? There's only so much capacity in our muscles throughout our bodies and our liver, right? If we could store endless glycogen in our liver and our muscles would just be perpetually growing, right? Because we're perpetually eating. But we don't. There's a limited amount of glycogen that we can store. You might recall from Unit 1, adipose, fat tissue, is another way that we store calories or energy. And as you've probably noticed, we do have an endless capacity for storing calories in adipose tissue, right? When we eat and eat and eat, our fat tissue expands, expands, expands. So glycogen is really limited storage for glucose, which is energy, and then adipose is sort of endless storage of fat, which is energy. The little middle part here says that we don't find glycogen so much in our food, which is in part because again, we only find glycogen in animals. So of the animals we eat, right, cows, pigs, poultry, so those animals will have some glycogen stored in their muscle and their liver, but when they're killed, so that we can eat their meat, the whole process of death will actually largely use up their glycogen stores. So by the time we eat their flesh, there isn't really any significant amount of glycogen for us to eat. So we don't refer to glycogen in our food. We really only refer to glycogen in our bodies, the storage form of glucose in our liver and our muscles. And then the third type of complex carbohydrate is fiber. All of these are really important, so I'm not starring all of these pages because they're all really, really important pages. So fiber is, again, these long, complex polysaccharide chains. Dietary fibers are non-digestible. We only find fiber in plants. That's another important piece to note, right? We really only find carbohydrate in plant, right? We have glycogen in our bodies, which is a type of carbohydrate. But as far as carbohydrate in our food, it's only plants. So when we talk about fiber and starch as two types of carbohydrate, we're only going to find fiber in plants. We're only going to find starch in plants. Your book refers to functional fibers as, again, non-digestible carbohydrate from the plant that basically get turned into supplements. All fiber is pretty functional, so I don't really, there's not a ton, for our purposes, we're not going to pay much attention to the concept of functional fibers. So we'll leave it at that. We're going to kind of think about fibers as one large category. There are two subdivisions of fiber that I do want you to know: soluble fiber, and we'll talk about insoluble fiber. Definitely do need to know these really well. So soluble fiber, as the name implies, it's soluble in water. So soluble fibers will absorb water when we eat them and start to digest them. Or even if you cook with soluble fibers, I think the classic examples are like oats, chia seeds, even flax seeds, right? Even if you were to just put some oats in a bowl and then put water in them, the oats are going to soak up that water and kind of expand, right? Same thing with chia seeds or flax seeds. That's because they have so much soluble fiber. So they are, we say, viscous and gel forming, these soluble fibers. Soluble fibers, because they're soluble, are also fermentable, meaning digestible by the bacteria that live in our guts, in our intestines. Because they're soluble, right, because they can dissolve in water, they're more accessible to those bacteria. So soluble fibers are critical for feeding our healthy gut bacteria. Because of their solubility, let me say, because of their viscousness, right, which is due to their solubility, soluble fibers have the ability to kind of stick to or bind a lot of waste material in the colon. One of those waste products might be excess cholesterol or excess saturated fat. We're going to learn a lot more about cholesterol and saturated fat as they relate to cardiovascular disease in chapter 5. But soluble fibers, their job is to basically bind everything in the colon and package it, kind of nicely so that when you have a bowel movement, when you go poop, you have this nice stuck together piece of stool. It's soluble fiber that holds everything together. So if you think about the quality of your stool, if it's kind of loose, a little runny, or even if it's like hard, a little constipation and it's like kind of little turds that are hard to pass, you probably don't have enough soluble fiber, right? But if you have these awesome, amazing bowel movements that just come out no problem, and it's one nice clump of everything stuck together, you're probably getting a good amount of soluble fiber. So in that process of clumping everything together, soluble fibers can bind cholesterol, can bind saturated fat, and can bind other waste products in the colon and get them out of our bodies. So in that way, soluble fibers reduce the risk for cardiovascular disease and can reduce the risk for type 2 diabetes. We find soluble fibers in fruits, especially berries, as well as oats and legumes. So oats, This is from your textbook, sorry. So I'm shaking my head. Oats is an example of a whole grain, but really any whole grain provides a good amount of soluble fiber. There are also tons of different types of soluble fibers. We won't go into great detail in this class, but 3 examples listed here are pectin, gum, and mucilage. Those are 3 types of soluble fibers. So sometimes a food company is going to add soluble fiber into a food, and you might see in the ingredients list, remember from Unit 1, you might see pectin listed or some type of gum listed, or rarely you'll see like a mucilage. But these are just 3 types of soluble fibers. So if you see them, you know that soluble fiber has been added into the food. Insoluble fibers then are insoluble. They don't dissolve in water, and they're not viscous. Therefore, they cannot be fermented by bacteria in the colon. Insoluble fibers, though, are really important because they promote bowel movements, they can alleviate constipation, and they can significantly reduce diverticulosis. We'll talk about that at the end of the chapter. So an analogy that I really like with insoluble fibers is a broom. If you've ever swept your house or swept, the stairs or the patio or wherever you might sweep, or maybe you have a job where you have to sweep up at the end of the night. A broom, right? Those broom bristles are really thick and coarse and tough, right? And what they're doing is like sweeping all the debris, and what you're doing is sweeping all the debris into a concentrated area. So in a similar fashion, insoluble fibers work in our colon. So you can think of your colon, ascending, transverse, descending. The job of the colon, remember, largely the job of the colon is to get the waste out. Soluble fibers help with this by clumping everything together. Insoluble fibers help with getting all the waste out by kind of sweeping it all along and saying, okay, let's move towards the rectum and let's get out of here. So when it says promotes a regular bowel movement, if we have enough insoluble fibers in our diet, that's where we're going to have people who go poop like clockwork, right? Every morning you wake up and within a half hour you've got to poop. That's because there was enough insoluble fiber in the colon to say, okay, we've been sweeping all night and now we're down here at the colon, at the rectum, we're ready to have a bowel movement. When we don't have enough insoluble fiber coming in the diet, even if we have enough soluble fiber, but not enough insoluble fiber, we could feel really bloated, really constipated, right? That's why insoluble fiber alleviates constipation. Because even if we have great soluble fiber and everything's bound together, there's nothing that's saying, okay, now get it out of here. That's the job of insoluble fiber, is to say, okay, get the poop out of here. So a really critical part of our diet. So again, let's even just pause here for a second, because going back to the beginning, I've been talking about how absolutely critical carbohydrates are for our bodies, right? Absolutely critical. On this slide, at the very beginning of the chapter, we said carbohydrates are an important source of energy, and that's kind of all that's written here. But what should also be written here is that carbohydrates are critical for gut health. Absolutely critical for the health of our digestive system, which we cutely summarize as gut health, right? And gut health, if you remember in chapter 3, we talked about that really intricate connection between the brain and the gut. And we said that whatever is happening in the gut is going to influence the brain. Whatever is happening in the brain is going to influence the gut. So gut health then is really critical. It's not the only thing that's critical, but gut health does have a really important influence on mental health, right? Emotional health, well-being, cognitive health, right? Carbohydrates are critical for gut health, which means they can be part of the critical equation for good mental health. And it is particularly, specifically, the fibers that assist in gut health. So I'm not, I'm not trying to sit here and say, let's all go drink a bunch of soda because it technically has carbohydrate in it. What I am saying is let's all go eat a bunch of fiber because we absolutely need fiber to maintain a healthy digestive system, which really not only supports our mental health, but it supports just our overall health and well-being. Remember, the digestive system, in particular the colon, is like taking the trash out, right? What if you just stopped taking your trash out? Lots of problems would arise, right? Lots of problems. So in the same way, we need to take the trash out of our bodies, and that's the digestive system, that's the colon, that's fiber, insoluble and soluble. So food sources of insoluble fiber are, again, only plant foods. We don't find fiber in animals. Whole grains, seeds, beans, fruits, and vegetables. And then again, up here are 3 examples. Just like soluble fiber, there are lots of different types of insoluble fiber. So these are 3 examples: lignin, cellulose, and hemicellulose. So again, we see insoluble fiber much more infrequently in like as an additive. Really the best and perhaps only way to get insoluble fiber is to eat whole grains, beans, fruits, and vegetables, quite honestly, on a daily basis, best case scenario at every meal. Okay, so a little review of carbohydrate digestion. Let's go back to highlighter, I guess. So we break carbohydrates, most carbohydrates, down into monosaccharides, right? That's the process of digestion, to take these large complex carbohydrates, especially starch, because we're not digesting too much fiber and we don't have glycogen in our food. So digestion really takes these large starches and breaks them down into their monosaccharides, which are glucose. Oops. Remember we talked about salivary amylase? So it's a enzyme in the saliva that digests, I said, starch or carbohydrate, right? Remember that amyl, I said, remember amyl means starch. And back again, amyl, amylose, amyl, amylopectin, right? Starch, amylose, amylopectin, amylase. So amylase is the enzyme that breaks down starch. If it's salivary amylase, it's the enzyme in the mouth, in the saliva. Remember also, going all the way back to here, I said that maltose really only exists as part of the digestive process, right, or fermentation. So when we break amylose and amylopectin down, we're kind of breaking them down into disaccharides and then ultimately into monosaccharides. We wind up with a fair amount of maltose in the digestion of amylose and amylopectin. So breaks starches down to maltose. Carbohydrate digestion does not occur in the stomach. Stomach acids inactivate the amylase, right? Salivary amylase cannot function in the stomach. And then the majority of carbohydrate digestion occurs in the small intestine. Remember, we also introduced pancreatic amylase. So again, a starch digesting enzyme made by the pancreas, sent into the duodenum via that pancreatic duct to work in the small intestine. Again, starch to maltose. And then also in the small intestine, but now right up close to those enterocytes, those absorptive cells, we have yet a few more enzymes. So these enzymes live in that microvilli region, those tiny little like hair-like projections off of the enterocyte, off the digestive cells, or the absorptive cells, excuse me. So these enzymes take the disaccharide down to the monosaccharide. So we have the enzyme maltase, which breaks maltose down into glucose and glucose. We have sucrase, which will break fructose and glucose apart. And we have lactase, as infants anyway, to break glucose and galactose. And then those individual monosaccharides will get absorbed into the mucosal cell or the enterocyte that lines the small intestine. and then enter the bloodstream. So we also said transportation. So this is still really absorption, but transportation across the cell membrane. Remember glucose, and we didn't say galactose yet, but glucose and galactose are absorbed via active transport. So they need the carrier protein and an energy source, whereas fructose is absorbed via facilitated diffusion. So it needs a carrier protein, but no energy, no calories required. So it's a slower absorption process. Remember, we talked about that a little bit in chapter 3. If we take in foods that are really concentrated in fructose, which doesn't occur in nature, we only have highly concentrated fructose after a lot of processing. It's like you can't go out and just go into the woods and drink high fructose corn syrup. You have to go get it at the grocery store where it was previously manufactured by some laboratory. So any high fructose containing food we might eat will often cause GI distress because that fructose is just going to sit around there in the intestines for a long time because the absorption of it is really slow. But if we have normal amounts of fructose, like occur in corn on the cob or your fruits, then there's only so much fructose to be absorbed, and it's generally not going to cause a problem. This, again, I apologize, I erased the name of the chart or what number it was, but this is a really helpful chart, I think, just going over carbohydrate digestion. Remember, this over here is just really review from chapter 3. And then over here, this I think is just helpful to kind of show you the visual of amylose being broken down into shorter chains, amylopectin being broken down into shorter chains, and then ultimately into maltose, and that's in the mouth. Some of that still happens also in the small intestine, but then really in the small intestine, we see those disaccharides being broken down into the monosaccharides. And remember, we said it happens right here on the brush border, right, or in those microvilli region of the enterocytes, right? So this is where we see sucrase breaking down sucrose, maltase breaking down maltose, and lactase breaking down lactose. And then in the large intestine, this is where we have the bacteria fermentation of resistant starches and soluble fibers, and where the soluble and insoluble fibers work together to pack the stool and then get it out. So, one last thing here, right? So once inside the enterocyte, so it's the monosaccharides. Let me highlight that, I guess. It's the monosaccharides that get absorbed into the enterocytes and ultimately then into the bloodstream. We are not absorbing sucrose. We're not absorbing maltose. We're not absorbing lactose. We need to break those apart into their individual monosaccharides, and then we absorb the monosaccharides. So fructose, glucose, and galactose can then all enter the blood, and they do, and they travel to the liver. Fructose and galactose get converted to glucose in the liver, and then we have all sorts of glucose. So once in the blood, so once the liver processes fructose and galactose into glucose, it can send those out back into the blood. The glucose in the bloodstream can then provide immediate energy wherever it might be needed, right? So different cells throughout the body can pick it up and utilize it. Whenever there's excess glucose, we're going to store it as glycogen. And again, we store glycogen in the liver and in the muscles. So liver glycogen is an important storage source because we'll see ultimately it can help maintain blood glucose levels. For example, if you, let's say you ate dinner last night at like 5, and now let's say today you wait until like noon to eat anything, right? You're going to be pretty hungry somewhere in the early morning maybe. So your liver's job, right, or your blood glucose as part of that hunger process, your blood glucose level is going to drop a bit. Your liver can start to break down its stored glucose, which is glycogen, and start to provide some of that glucose, put that back in the blood to raise your blood glucose levels back to normal levels. The liver can also share some of its stored glucose with the brain the spinal cord, and red blood cells. So liver glycogen is really kind of maintaining, it's like the storage. Let's think about it as like closets in your house, right? So we really only have two glycogen closets. We have muscle tissue has glycogen closets, and the liver has glycogen closets. But the liver is providing that glycogen basically to the brain and the blood, the brain and the blood. Whereas the muscles, that's for the muscles. So muscle glycogen is for the muscles. The liver glycogen is for the brain and the blood, right? Because the brain can't really store so much glycogen, and the blood can't really store so much glycogen. That wouldn't really work. But your muscles can store a little bit of glycogen for their own use. So glycogen stored in the muscles provides energy to the muscles, particularly during exercise. Here's a nice little, I guess, picture of carbohydrate absorption and storage, showing the liver and some muscles. So the dietary carbohydrates from the stomach are delivered to the small intestine. Remember, glucose and other monosaccharides get absorbed ultimately into the enterocyte, into the blood, travel to the liver. Fructose and galactose are converted to glucose. Glucose can then be stored as glycogen, and that glycogen can be used to maintain the brain and the blood. That's what the glycogen can be used for. But then the glucose can go out again for any body cell. And in particular, glucose will go to muscles. And the muscles can use that immediately if they need it. Or if they don't need it immediately, they can restock their closets, right? They can restock their glycogen supply. Remember, humans don't have the enzymes to break apart those beta bonds. Let me write that again. Beta bonds, right? It's literally the beta bond that we can't break apart, that our enzymes can't break apart. But bacteria in the large intestines can break these fibers apart. So the bacterial fermentation of soluble fibers produces sometimes some gas and some short chain fatty acids. I've mentioned this before, but this is the first time we're seeing it in writing. So the short chain fatty acids, we then absorb into the enterocytes and pass them out into the bloodstream. And we can use those short chain fatty acids in our immune system. We can use them in our brain and spinal cord to make neurotransmitters. And we can use those fatty acids for metabolism. And metabolism is ultimately kind of covers almost any process in the body. So these short chain fatty acids are really, this is part of where we say it's a symbiotic, or part of why we say it's a symbiotic relationship that we have with these healthy gut bacteria, because they digest some of our fiber, and in doing so, they give to us these nutrients that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get. And we then utilize those nutrients for really important life function. And then again, the rest of the fiber is just really going to be used to make the stool and get it out. Okay, so I think I was hoping to get through blood glucose regulation in this recording, but I'm probably going to save it for the second part, but I will at least begin a little overview. So first and foremost, I've already mentioned this concept before, but not so directly, but I've mentioned the idea of blood glucose regulation. So kind of, I guess we could say, like, just as importantly as like your heart beating and your lungs breathing, right, your diaphragm expanding and contracting so you can breathe, the amount of glucose that's in our blood is arguably just as important as the heart beating and the lungs breathing. There's a really fine range, like not too much, not too little. There's a really fine range for blood glucose concentration, so the amount of glucose that's in our blood. If we have too much glucose in our blood, that can cause a lot of problems. We'll talk about at the end of the chapter. If we have too little glucose in the blood, that can cause serious problems. At any time, especially like after a meal, or if we've been too long without a meal, we might kind of normally go just above the healthy range or just below the healthy range. That's okay, right? We can manage that. What becomes really problematic is when we go way above the range or way below the range, right? Ideally, we want to stay right in the range. So we might come right up to the top. We might get right down to the bottom of the range, right? Right up to the top, right to the bottom. But sometimes we go way above the range and way below the range. And we'll talk more about that again at the end of the chapter, why that can be so problematic. So when we eat a meal, right, we just said over here, when we eat a meal, we suddenly have all this glucose in the blood, right? So that should make sense. After a meal, our blood glucose is going to rise. Again, hopefully it's just going to go up, still within the healthy range, right? It's not going to go above the range. When we haven't had a meal for a while, right? So let's say we ate a meal, the blood glucose rose, we've got a nice amount of glucose, but then, we're using it, the liver's using it, the brain's using it, the muscle's using it. So then our blood glucose may start to drop, right? And it's when the blood glucose starts to come to the low end of the range. Remember we said that's part of the hunger signal? So once blood glucose gets low, that's where our brain is going to register, oh, blood glucose is low, I should eat something. That's going to be part of the signal that says, okay, let's go find some food. And then when you eat, the blood glucose is going to rise again. Right? So we mentioned insulin and glucagon. Really, we only mentioned them. But insulin and glucagon are two of the hormones that assist in blood glucose regulation. And then there's 4 others that we'll learn about in this chapter: epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone. So let's see. I know this is kind of a weird spot to pause, but I am going to pause here and then I'll pick up. So if you're really interested, just go ahead and pick back up with chapter 4, part 2 recording. But I am going to pause here because this gets into a really long conversation. So we'll do that in part 2. Alrighty. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.